Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Astebreed. Well, it's by a Japanese indie developer by the name of Edelweiss, and they work on games in their off time. I wouldn't even call them amateur developers, because they're clearly selling this. They also sold a few other games. One of them popped up on Steam. It was by the name of Ether Vapor, and Astebreed is a shmup. Now, I've got to be honest, I don't know a huge amount about the Japanese indie scene, and I was quite surprised to learn that there is, in fact, a growing indie scene in Japan focused on PC, which traditionally was a very console-focused market, and more recently has become a much more handheld-focused market, along, of course, with phone games. But arcades over there are still alive and well, and there are these kind of indie cabinets that you'll find in many arcades that have loads of games like this. And some of them are pretty good. Now, if you want to have a look at the Japanese indie scene in more detail, there's a great video by Super Bunny Hop. I'm going to put a link in the description below this video. It's describing a lot of Japanese titles, and I think you'll learn quite a bit from that. But I stumbled across the Japanese indie scene when I looked at a game called Unholy Heights, which was sent to me by the Playism site, which is an indie site specializing in Japanese indie stuff. But some of that stuff is making its way onto PC and, of course, making its way onto Steam as well. You probably remember Recettear or Recettear, whichever you prefer. Both of them work. It was, I believe, ported over by a company called Carpe Fulgor. And they ported over a couple of other things as well. But that's perhaps the most well-known. And some of that stuff is starting to make its way into the Western market, and some of it is quite good. Now, of course, Japan has a history of bullet hell shmups. Astebreed is not really what I call a bullet hell shmup. It's a lot easier than many of those games, and you also don't die in one hit. But it's got a number of very unique features, so I'm going to go and check that out. Firstly, as per many Japanese indie titles, the setup is just terrible. The control setup is designed for a controller in mind. You can use the keyboard, but it only lets you use certain buttons on the keyboard, which makes binding it almost impossible. And it doesn't even use the right designation for each key. It's like, oh, this is button 6. So what do you mean it's button 6? This is button 37. What? So using the keyboard for this game is nigh on impossible. So if you don't have a controller, well, unfortunately, you might have to just bail on it entirely. It's not the first game, certainly, that I've played from a Japanese developer that's had this same problem. But of course, a lot of these games are designed to be played, one with controllers or two, on those actual cabinets that have analog sticks or indeed 8-way sticks and a standardized kind of 6-button setup. So it's a little bit understandable, but I think it's certainly something they need to work on if they're going to continue to release games in the West, because of course that's, by our standards, it just isn't really acceptable. Okay. Graphics settings, you've got a few, and we're actually going to put the VSync on because I've noticed a certain degree of tearing. Tends to happen when the game gets really, really fast, but we have that sorted out right there. It seems to have affected the way that the recording software is grabbing the game, so I will perhaps have to change back to turning VSync off, but we'll try it and see if it's okay. It's claiming that it's dropping a couple of frames here and there now, so hopefully that's not the case. But outside of that, you've got pretty standard options here. Now, you can't control any of this with the mouse, by the way, so this is either going to be a keyboard thing or controller, so just bear that in mind. Alright, that's pretty much it, so let's jump into the game itself, and I can do a chapter select. I'll probably jump into chapter 1 or 2, and as you can see, you will be flying around in a, I wouldn't necessarily say a stereotypical kind of mecha, but I've seen a couple of mechas that look very similar to this. Heck, I actually recently watched a series called Knights of Sidonia on Netflix, which had some reasonably similar kind of ideas behind it. I think that there's definitely a few elements of mecha that are always going to be the same, regardless of which particular series you're watching. Now, we've got a couple of settings here, including the score system as well as the difficulty, which we looked at earlier. Now, on normal mode, the game is not really that hard, to the point where I've been able to make it to the final level, although the final boss is kicking my ass at the moment. And that probably took me about an hour and a half of working at it. I have died a few times, certainly on the bosses. I've never died to regular enemies, though. Okay, so you've got a choice here of neutral lock, enemy, or front, and then lock direction, normal, and reverse. Now, getting this right is a little tricky because the default lock system is really difficult to use. There's two kinds of lock-ons. There's one that just locks on in a 360-degree radius around your ship, and then there's one that travels further across the screen, but it's a cone and it aims in a particular direction. Now, the default setting, I believe, is enemy and reverse, and I have never got that one to work properly, so we're going to try normal and front just to see if that actually helps. I don't use lock-on all that much, but it's actually kind of necessary, as it turns out, to really get a high score. And that's what this game is all about. Alright, okay, so standard shmup fare, right? Well, yes and no. It's got some pretty interesting and unique features. So you've got a sword, which can actually be used to absorb the purple and yellow bullets. And that will allow you to charge up your EX attack, which you can then use to gain a temporary invulnerability shield. And you've got 3 different attacks that you can do with it. The standard one is kind of this AoE slash around your ship, which is going to kill pretty much anything within a small radius, and it's also going to give you a shield and destroy bullets that are heading your way. The second one involves locking on, so as you can see here, you can kind of do this in 2 different ways. So if I wanted to lock on there, I could then do that, which would allow me to do an EX dash, and then if you get a lock on and you press both the firing buttons and the sword button simultaneously, you do kind of an ultimate sword combo, which does a bunch of damage as well on a single enemy target. Now, the game kind of encourages you from the start to use the sword because you can deflect most attacks, although not all of them with it. And of course, as you can see, you do end up with a situation where you can be deflecting most of those bullets and you'll be getting a benefit from doing so. So that's kind of pretty cool. But your combo actually goes down if you use the sword. They know the sword is really, really good, so they actually kind of punish you for doing that, which is a fairly key component of the score attack system, which a game like this is going to be focused on for the most part. Now, you might notice that the game is changing perspective. That's one of the more interesting parts of the game. They willingly change perspective almost constantly, which is really cool. You've got side-scrolling, you've got scrolling vertically, you've got going backwards, you've got going forwards, you've got behind the shoulder, and it will do that several times often in a boss fight, which is a really interesting dynamic. So obviously in most boss fights you've kind of got phases. Well, in this game, it's not just phases you've got. As soon as you change to the next phase, it will change the perspective of the fight more often than not, which means that you almost switch between playing a game that's more like kind of Gradius or Ikaruga into playing sort of Panzer Dragoon or Rez or something like that, or Sin and Punishment, which is really awesome, actually. I approve of that. It's a really nice system, and it works well, too. Thankfully, the lock-on system, along with the 2 different kinds of attacks, one of which is focused like this, and one of which is kind of a widespread shotgun effect, allow you to hit your targets with relative ease, and there's also an area of effect on your sword combo slashes as well. So, overall, what you've got is a pretty slick combat system, but also a very fast-moving game that has elements of bullet hell. You know, it's got bullets flying everywhere, and it's very colorful and fast, and you're firing a lot of bullets as well. But it's not as punishing as a bullet hell game at all. You can take quite a lot of damage. You also have a dash, which gives you temporary invulnerability frames, which will allow you to avoid almost all the attacks in the game, although it does have a slight cooldown period and a rest period after the animation has completed, so you don't want to use it too much. It can be a little problematic. I am trying to lock on from this side, but I never get it right. I think it's got something to do with the left stick and the direction that you're currently moving, but I do find the lock-on system, at least outside of the circular one, which is fairly easy, to be a little difficult. I don't know, maybe I just haven't mastered it yet, but it does seem a little awkward more often than not. Ow, that was very, very painful. I probably shouldn't have sat there. There you go. So, outside of that, what has it got? Well, it does have a story. It seems to be kind of fairly cliche anime stuff. I'm gonna be honest, it's hard to keep track of it because most of the story exposition is done in Japanese with subtitles, but the subtitles pop up in the middle of a fight, which you're not gonna see that. You can obviously watch the cutscenes, but in the middle of a fight, you gotta be kidding me. No way am I gonna be looking at that when there's 5,000 bullets flying at me. So, that's not a particularly good idea. I think it could actually do, certainly with some voice acting work, but, you know, we are talking about a tiny Japanese indie dev here, so it's not unreasonable to suggest that all of the translation will merely end up being just in text form rather than actual voice acting. And let's be honest, will it be any good even if they do go for it? It's debatable. There's a big history of pretty bad translation, and more to the point, just poor voice acting when it comes to taking Japanese material. I mean, even AAA games have similar problems to that. But the work is very, very impressive. I mean, it's nicely colorful. Everything moves extremely quickly. I mean, it's a riot of color, really, but you don't have any real problems keeping track of what's going on the screen, which I absolutely love. I think it's very easy for that kind of nonsense to occur, but in this case, they seem to have avoided that entirely. You know exactly where your I assume it's crossbreed. I mean, they call it X-breed. I don't know. Half the time, they actually mean that, and half the time in Japanese stuff, whether it be games or kind of anime, they mean cross. So it could be either of those. I'm not 100% sure. Alright, well, that was a bit of a better score than I did on Chapter 2 the last time around, which is good. But I don't know what that is like compared to everybody else. There is a set of leaderboards, so you can do that comparison. Now, if I was going to say anything about the game, if I was going to criticize it, there's not really a lot to criticize with it, because frankly, what it does really, really well, and I've been enjoying this an awful lot more than most shmups that I've experienced. It's the fact that the game is not very long. The last chapter is Chapter 6, and I would imagine someone that's skilled at shmups on normal could be beating this game in under an hour. It took me about an hour and a half to reach Chapter 6, and I'm kind of constantly getting my ass kicked on the final boss, because it does seem to be pretty tricky. But the counter-argument to that is that most games like this are designed to be score attacks, yeah? And they're designed to have a set of mechanics that are hopefully fairly in-depth, that allow for all manner of different cool things to happen, and interesting interactions. For the most part, what it seems to be like here is encouraging you not to use the sword, which is almost like an I win button. What you want to be doing is doing a lot more lock-ons to build your combo up. You want to be holding on to your shield for the longest time and not taking damage, and just stacking up various multipliers. And it'll take a little bit of learning to make sure that you know exactly what the optimal way to get the combos together actually is. Now, I don't really care about score attack. I never really have. It's not a big deal to me, so I'm entirely fine just kind of overusing the sword as long as I'm able to get through the game. But that does mean that once you've beaten it, there's really not a huge amount to kind of go back to unless you want to do score attack. So I think the price point becomes a factor there. The game is on Steam, I believe, about $15. At the moment, you can actually pick it up for $10 on Playerism, so it's a little bit cheaper. But if you are not the kind of person that really goes for score attack, then this might be the kind of game that burns out on you quite quickly, and you'll probably have a good couple of hours worth of fun, but that might be about it. So, I mean, that is a little unfortunate. But ultimately, what you're looking at is a quite literal arcade game. Something that was designed to be played on an arcade cabinet, and is about the score attack, and about the hard difficulty, and about getting the best possible result. It's not about beating the game, it's about how well you beat the game. And that seems to be the way that that ends up working out. Outside of that, though, let's just ignore the price for a second, because, I mean, I got it as part of the Humble Bundle. I paid to make sure that I got all of the stuff as the Humble Bundle, but there's a bunch of stuff like Gigantic Army and One Way Heroics that I wanted to play in there, so I thought, hey, I'll give this a bash. And as part of a bundle, it's like, wow, this game is really, really fun. It has very, very tight controls. I don't feel the game is unfair at all. In fact, it may be a little bit too fair in comparison to certain other titles. And it reminds me of playing some of the older, more kind of Western shooters. Obviously, if you ignore the subject matter for a second, and the fact that you have to keep just sort of bashing the button to fire, which is a bit of a trademark of these kind of games, and you'll say, well, you know, this could very well be a classic Western shmup of old. You know, why not? Why not? There's so much flying around on the screen at any given time, and it gives you a lot of options. One thing I will say is that it is very focused on its particular set of mechanics. It's like, look, these are the things that you have at your disposal. We are not going to alter that throughout the game. There are no power-ups or anything along those lines. You don't go in between missions and buy items like you would in, say, Star Gunner or Raptor Call of Shadows, which I gotta admit, I do like that a lot. I think that's a really cool element of it. Things like jets and guns have a lot of that, and buying and customizing your ship is a big deal in games like this. But if you are looking for a game that's just focused on absolute madness on the screen, but is not as punishing as some of the more crazy bullet hell games, then Astebreed is pretty damn good, and if you are looking for a score attack game, then the game actually has that as well, and you'll probably find a fairly simple but elegant system which requires a great deal of practice to play optimally, which is, frankly, exactly what you would want from a game like that, right? What else would you want? I still don't think it's Ikaruga or anything along those lines. You know, I think Ikaruga is certainly something of a classic, both mechanically and just in terms of pure aesthetic design. But Astebreed is pretty damn good, and it's an extremely impressive piece of work from a part-time team in Japan. And if this is the kind of thing that Japan is currently making for PC, then I certainly hope that we see a great deal more of it, because it is a lot of fun. It is very gameplay focused. There is a story there, but I pretty much just ignored it and just soaked in the mechanics of the title and just the bright, colorful, and manic visuals. And I've had a damn good time with it. My fingers hurt. I wish they kind of had an auto-fire button. I should probably mod my controller for that, but it's good. It really is. Astebreed is really quite something. Surprisingly enough, it's currently the highest rated PC game on Metacritic at the moment, which I found a little odd, certainly. I think it's very strange to see that be the case. I don't know if it is the best game to come out on PC this year so far. I don't think so. But what it does well. And I have a great deal of respect for games that are focused on particular mechanics and they do them excellently. And you're about to say, oh, you know, what about, you hated Sacred because it didn't have enough going on. Yeah, but the thing is, this game has just enough going on, and what it has going on is really, really good. Whereas if you end up playing a game like, say, Sacred 3, where it's just kind of bashing the same button over and over again, there's no real skill involved, it's much more difficult to appreciate it. So, Astebreed, it's really, really good. Although, if you don't have a controller, you probably don't want to play it, as I mentioned earlier, because you're not going to get very far. The key rebinding is a freaking nightmare. Not to mention the transition between 2D and 3D sections can make keyboard controls a little bit tricky. I still haven't kind of got used to the lock-on system, really, and I don't know, maybe I could do it a little bit more effectively with more practice. I'm gonna get murdered here, good lord. But Astebreed is a damn fine title, and is perhaps worthy of your attention, particularly if you're buying the bundle. Absolutely worthwhile. Ladies and gentlemen, a look at Astebreed. Currently available on PC, on Steam, and Playerism in the Humble Bundle. My name's been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.